So I think that Biden inherits in this region, like everywhere else, a kind of a trust deficit in terms of US, the word of the U.S. Here you negotiate a trade deal with the U.S. What does it mean?
Hello and welcome to On the Level. I'm Jeff Hutton. During the Obama presidency, being a U.S. diplomat or a regular citizen just about anywhere overseas was a tiny bit easier by dint of the popularity of the then president. In Indonesia, he was adored because of his connection to Jakarta. He has a half-sister here. Donald Trump's belligerence, name-calling, deal-breaking, pulling out of multilateral organizations, the Muslim ban, put paid to that goodwill. So when Joe Biden assumes the top job in January, he faces the daunting challenge of rebuilding the U.S.'s reputation at a time when China is asserting claims to the South China Sea and pumping investment into Indonesia. China, together with Hong Kong, which for all intents and purposes is a Chinese city now, was Indonesia's biggest source of investment after Singapore, with $1.7 billion in realized capital during the year to September. The US ranks 7th. So I wanted to talk to someone who's been around the region as a reporter since the 1990s, and who has seen administrations change and the impact that Washington can have here. Lin Neumann is the managing director of the American Chamber of Commerce. He helped set up the capital's second English language daily, the Jakarta Globe, and he seemingly knows everyone. He's the guy you go to for the backstory. I love talking with Lin. There's a whole 20 minutes of conversation before this interview. Friends, here's Lin Neumann. Lin Neumann, thanks so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
Lin, you've been through this a little bit. You know, you've been in the region. You've been in Jakarta. Help me out. How long have you actually been in Jakarta?
12 years, or so. Who's counting? At least 12 years.
Just sort of stepping back from your experience as we change administrations, what would we expect in terms of nuts and bolts and in policy? Would we see a new ambassador, for example? Would we see a wholesale change in policy going from Trump, assuming he leaves, to Biden? What kind of changes might we see in the coming months?
Well, one of the good things about the way the United States has traditionally dealt with Indonesia diplomatically in recent years, at least since Suharto left, is that it's handled as a professional post. So we've just had a new ambassador arrive, Kim Sung, from the U.S., and he's a first-rate diplomat, and most importantly, like all ambassadors to Indonesia, he's a career diplomat. So we don't have the president's buddy who's an insurance salesman who happened to raise a bunch of money for him and then goes golfing with him, suddenly become our ambassador, which I think is problematic in a lot of countries. So we have professional ambassadors drawn from the Foreign Service, and that has worked out pretty well. We have a pretty good track record of having really good ambassadors in Indonesia to maintain the relationship. So I wouldn't expect any changes in the immediate, embassy front. I think what we're all looking forward to as far as changes, both in policy towards Indonesia and policy towards the region, is a little more predictability and rationality in the way things work moving forward. Nobody, as we all know, nobody could figure out what the Trump administration was going to do next or might do next. And I think that was stressful for policymakers on all levels. Now, that said, to be fair to the outgoing U.S. administration, they did engage with Indonesia a good bit. We had visits by the vice president. We had visits by Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary. Last year, we had a visit to Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, came here just recently. So there's been a fair amount of high-level attention paid to Indonesia. But I think you can judge from the rapid congratulations that President Jokowi sent to President-elect Biden that there's an eagerness to get back to a sort of a friendlier, calmer environment of relations, and so I think that's what will happen. I believe we'll get. I don't know who the Secretary of State will be. There's a lot of names floating around, but I think we'll get a professional in the State Department, somebody who understands diplomacy. I suspect that Indonesia will continue to be quite important to the United States on a geostrategic basis because of its location in the South China Sea and its position as the largest country in ASEAN. I would expect that the U.S. will continue to be wary and fairly aggressive towards China, but perhaps a little more predictable in the trajectory of that relationship. So all of that would seem to indicate that Indonesia will continue to be important to the U.S. And should be important to the U.S. I think, if anything, I would fault the Americans in past years for sometimes just kind of throwing their hands up and said, we don't understand this place. And I think that instead of that attitude, it's important to engage with Indonesia and to see it as something other than a potential source of terrorism or a bulwark against China, and to grasp the economic importance of it more fully. And I think that's what I would look forward to seeing.
Well, I want to hold on that point just for a moment. The sort of the chaos in the White House versus the proof in the pudding, as it were. The Vice President, Mike Pence, visited here within months of taking office. Yep. And there have been cabinet level visits semi-regularly. I saw a BBC interview with you, and you mentioned that Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, visited. It was the first visit from a Commerce Secretary in decades.
Well, not like decades. Penny Pritzker, the Obama Commerce Secretary, went to an ASEAN meeting in Bali, but she never did a bilateral visit to Jakarta, which was unfortunate. We always thought that she should. And I think going back, it had been maybe 15, 20 years since there had been a proper bilateral visit from a U.S. Commerce Secretary.
So if you were to give a scorecard, a report card, of how the Trump administration handled its relations with Indonesia, what score would you give it?
Well, I think what a lot of us felt throughout the Trump administration was kind of like relief that Indonesia wasn't on the radar. In a sense, it wasn't on the president's radar, President Trump's radar. Those countries that were on his radar became targets, right? Korea for defense spending, and China on trade, and various other things. Germany, France. He'd get pissed off with these countries, and then everything would go south. He never really had any overwhelming reason to get involved in Indonesia. There was the review of the General System of Preferences on Trade, the GSP, and that was triggered by a trade deficit between the U.S. and Indonesia, but it never resulted in an angry speech, right? Somehow or another, the anti-Muslim rhetoric of the president did not result in banning Indonesians. If anything, it resulted in cooler heads trying to say, hey, wait a minute, this is a moderate democracy, which was Pence's take on it, or Pompeo's take on it. So it never became a target. And of course, Indonesia is not a formal U.S. ally, so there's no alliance to break. There's no treaty relationship to dismember. So I think Indonesia is a part of the strategic calculation on the Indo-Pacific. And that's the way the State Department handled the relationship. Beyond that, all the big U.S. businesses are here in some fashion or another. And so when, for instance, Wilbur Ross came, he brought a big business delegation. That's good. We're all for that. We want business here. We want more American companies to invest in Indonesia. I certainly can't fault them for that. That was a good thing. So the country never felt the brunt of any of the kind of assaults that President Trump made on other allies and dislocation in those relationships. I mean, and that's good. That's a good thing. So
the absence of a negative.
Well, yeah, it's kind of weird. But we used to wonder, God, I hope he's not going to get excited about Indonesia, And so that left it to the diplomats, those cabinet secretaries who were interested, and frankly, as the American Chamber of Commerce, we got on well with these guys. We had good engagements when we wanted to with U.S. agencies. Good engagements with the USTR, with Commerce, with Treasury, and others. So I can't really fault that. I think in that sense, it's been okay.
Did that engagement yield results?
Well, what are results? At the end of the day, I don't know. There have been some new investments coming in, and the U.S. Embassy, especially, and also. People in Washington have helped to raise issues that needed to be raised with the government of Indonesia on the investment climate. I think those issues would have been raised regardless of whether we were dealing with a Republican or a Democratic administration. The issues were the same when Obama was in power. But I do think that some of the kind of business issues got raised by the administration with the Jokowi government. And that's helped to resolve a few things. I wouldn't say that it's been a massive game changer, but there have been some worthwhile discussions have taken place as part of the GSP review that yielded some results in terms of making trade a little bit fairer. The other thing is Indonesia, of course, has benefited somewhat from the dislocation of the U.S.-China trade war because it has resulted in some shift in commodity exports from here to the U.S., et cetera.
That trade row, how that gets resolved in a Biden administration is yet to be seen. I'm wondering, what is the overall condition in Southeast Asia that Biden is inheriting?
Well, I think, in my view, the single biggest negative action by President Trump early in his administration was to pull the U.S. out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And now we're on the brink of the
CPTPP? RCEP, yeah.
RCEP. So now we're on the brink of RCEP being signed, in which China will be the leading player. Under the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the U.S. was the leading player. China was not in it. And the U.S. was the architect of that deal. And Trump, for political reasons, I don't think he ever understood the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but he just decided trade is bad. America first, America's the greatest. We're going to do only bilateral deals. And I think that really set the U.S. back decades in terms of its position and standing in the region. Here for a long time, for many years, there was this negotiations on the TPP. It was nearly ready. And then the U.S. just abruptly pulled out the day Trump became president. What did the U.S. gain from that? What did U.S. companies gain from that? Nothing that I can see. So I think that Biden inherits in this region, like everywhere else, a kind of a trust deficit in terms of US, the word of the U.S. Here you negotiate a trade deal with the U.S. What does it mean? What does it mean if they just walk away? Like so many other deals that we walked away from. I think all of that harms the U.S. standing in the region. Now, of course, Indonesia was not part of the TPP. But if you think back, when President Jokowi went to Washington in 2015, yes, yeah. I was there. When Jokowi went to Washington in 2015, one of the things he said in his meeting with Obama was, I want to join the TPP. And this was huge news. Well, at least in our circles, and maybe not as big as Kim Jong Un and his missiles, but it's big news.
It was massive news here.
And the thing is that Indonesia was not ready then and isn't ready now to join the TPP or to join because of so many non-tariff trade barriers and other things within the system.
State-owned enterprises. I mean, that's why it's kind of chucked.
State-owned enterprises, and in a lot of ways, the economy is structured, and probably it will be some time before Indonesia wants to actually take the steps that would get it into something like the TPP. But the aspiration was there, and that's something you can work with. You can work with the aspiration and make some progress. So I thought it was enormously positive, and it was very I was very disappointed. As were, I think, most business types. I was very disappointed when Trump pulled out of TPP. I think it was a big mistake.
Well, it was an Obama policy, and he hates all things Obama. It didn't matter. It could have been a policy that gave $100 to everyone every month, and he would have still canceled it. But imagine now. So
other than that, how do you really feel, Jeff?
Is my name on the podcast? But imagine now, there's been a flash on Twitter, there's been an update on Twitter, and it turns out that you are Biden's nominee for ambassador to Indonesia. And you said earlier in this interview that sometimes people throw their hands up in the air because they don't know what to make of this place. Your advice to President-elect Biden upon your after you've handed over your credentials to Joko Lee?
Well, I think my advice to first of all, Biden knows Indonesia. He's been here before. He's a seasoned professional. I think he was on the Foreign Affairs Committee at various points. So I think he understands more or less how to deal with Indonesia. I think, the advice about Indonesia would be, first of all, pay attention to what they're saying, listen carefully, and appreciate the fact that on a diplomatic level, Indonesia has been a very skilled country for many, many years. The foreign ministry is probably the best ministry. Very skilled diplomats. They managed to walk this fine line between lots of different powers without antagonizing anybody. And I think that's to their credit. I think this 1,000 friends and no enemies policy that they pursue is a good thing. And you have to also remember that Indonesians played a crucial role in the negotiations over the UN Law of the Sea. One of their diplomats, former U.S. Ambassador Dino Padi Jalal's father, was one of the architects of that treaty and is one of the real moving forces behind that treaty. And so these are all things that remain relevant, and Indonesia understands its geopolitical significance and understands how to play that and work that. So that's one thing. That's thing number one. Thing number two, doesn't help to lecture. Americans are very fond of lecturing, and I'd be happy to lecture the Indonesians all day long about how, self-serving nationalism is not to their benefit, and there's too much state involvement in the economy, and et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't do any good. This is a very, very difficult country to govern with so many special interests and vested interests and political balancing that's necessary, that it's really hard to say how anybody would govern that much differently. To be honest, I think there's a lot of policies that I would like to see pursued differently, because I think a more open economy, a more genuine enthusiasm about investment would benefit the people of Indonesia. And I think maybe we'll get there. I think we're taking some steps in that direction. But on the other hand, as I said, listen carefully to what the Indonesians are saying and why they're saying it, and pay attention to that, and don't lecture. Especially don't spend too much time lecturing in public. It's not very well received. The U.S. can't help but lecture in public, but I think after the experience that we've gone through in our own politics and are going through as we speak, we don't have a lot to lecture about right now. So I think the U.S. has to be seen on the international stage as a wounded power that has to rebuild its reliability and its trustworthiness as a friend. And that means that going forward, whoever's the Secretary of State and the other top officials, I hope they're in listening mode, as Biden seems to be. That, I think, would serve the U.S. well in this region, in Indonesia particularly, but also in Thailand with all its difficulties, in the Philippines, which has its own kind of odd, to say the least, president. And so in all of these places, I think there are real challenges in ASEAN right now, and the U.S. would be well to engage, but also to manage expectations and to avoid prescriptions. I don't think this is the time to offer prescriptions. I think this is the time to offer friendship and help, and hopefully, for example, it's unfortunate that there was no U.S. leadership globally on the pandemic. I would hope, for example, the pandemic's a big problem in Indonesia. I would hope that we would see more leadership there and that the Indonesians would welcome that. So that's what I hope to see.
What kind of hit has the turmoil, or at least the perceptions of turmoil during the U.S. elections, have had on the reputation of the United States in particular and democracy in general? Do you think it's had a lasting negative impact?
In Indonesia or beyond?
In Indonesia.
Well, one of the things that I take away from my engagement with Indonesia, which actually lived here for 12 years, but it goes back to 97, 98 when I first started getting involved. In those years, I was based in New York and then in Thailand, and I came to Indonesia a good bit. What I take away from this period after Suharto is that Indonesia, for all the worries that we had in 2000, 2001 about the dissolution of the countries, talk about the balkanization of Indonesia, that, Aceh would go one way and the Moluccos would go another way. And of course, East Timor split away and God knows what was going to happen to Papua. And, it was easy to imagine the dissolution of the unitary state at that time. And there was a lot of worry about it, but never happened. And Indonesia never had an extra legal transfer of power. Every president, for all the foibles in the system, for all the difficulties, for all the worries, every transfer of power has been legal and constitutional. Even from the late, great Gus Dur to Megawati, it was legal, it followed the procedures and the processes of the time. And that's really been good for Indonesia. So Indonesia's experience of democracy, I think, has been enormously valuable because it has relieved some of the stresses in the system and given more people a voice and feel like they have a stake in the system. But it's always a close run thing. We always wonder, how long can this last? This is such a difficult country. So I think that I don't think that Indonesia follows democracy because of the United States. I think Indonesia follows democracy because it's what works for Indonesia. It's what keeps the system working and balances out the various forces you have to balance to keep this country together. So I think that you might say that the image of U.S. democracy has been sadly damaged. And people will say, as they do to you, I'm sure, you live in Jakarta, people will say, I'm so sorry what's happening to your country. In the same way that people used to stop us on the street during the Obama years and say, wow, we really like your president. Congratulations. Now, whether that meant Obama was a terrifically effective leader in terms of Southeast Asia is a subject to question, but it did mean that he was popular, it was good for the image of the country, etc. But I don't think that Indonesian democracy falls or prospers off the back of the example of the United States. I think Indonesian democracy follows the practice of Indonesia. And in that regard, I'm pretty hopeful that democracy will continue as it's practiced here for all of its flaws, and that's pretty successful and pretty indigenous. So I don't really think that the troubles in the United States are going to dramatically change the fortunes of Indonesian democracy anyway.
You said in an interview just a few years ago, I think to Now Jakarta, that Indonesia is actually one of the more stable countries in the region.
It's the most stable country in the region, except Singapore.
Except Singapore. In fact, in itself, it is just taking, you didn't say this, but would you agree that in itself, it's actually an example, a model of democratic stability?
I would say so.
So far.
I would say so. Well, so far it's 20 years, 20 plus years already. We're in pretty good shape. The Democratic era began with the first elections in 99, I guess, right? I was an election observer at those elections. So we're in the third decade of democracy here. Of course, sometimes you get quite worried. We had Habib Rizak, the Imam Besar, came back from Saudi Arabia the other day.
Yes, we did.
And tied up traffic and scared a lot of us to see that. And we don't know what that means or what's going to happen. But we've had fears before. What's going to happen with this? What's going to happen with that? Oh my God, how will Indonesia stay together? But it has always managed to. So in that sense, I think in the political sense, Indonesia is an example of a stable democracy that continues to be able to manage its transfers of power and its relations within the political system peacefully and with some degree of harmony. And I think that's good. If you think back, I've been hanging around Southeast Asia since a long time. And when I first started coming to Southeast Asia in the 70s, I was living in the Philippines. It was martial law in the Philippines in the 70s and 80s. I was working as a journalist in the Philippines. Martial law in the Philippines. There was a military dictatorship for the most part in Thailand. Vietnam was just getting over the war, and things were this was pre-Doi Moi, so things were still pretty harsh. Cambodia was grappling with the experience of Pol Pot. Of course, Malaysia has always been authoritarian in a practice. So the whole region was really, and Indonesia was under Suharto. So the whole region was under authoritarian government at that time. And then we went through this democratic blossoming, right? The Philippines and Thailand and Cambodia, et cetera. Everybody became more democratic. And now we've gone back. Everybody's got problems again. And what country keeps lumbering along with the democracy that it instituted? The Philippines, Indonesia keeps kind of going along, plodding along. It doesn't set the world on fire. But on the other hand, the country has avoided so far having the kind of leadership that would create great schisms. Instead, you had the Yudhoyono period. Okay, there's controversies about how Yudhoyono governed, but he's a stable guy, hand at the wheel. Everybody felt like, well, okay, we know who's going to be there tomorrow. And Jokowi's kind of like that. He's still there. He's doing as he can. And those of us who follow the country closely might grumble about various policies, but the stability remains. And I think that's what gives Indonesia hope for the future. And that the U.S. is wise to pay attention to that and to perhaps learn from it, or perhaps at the very least work within that system for the kind of changes that are realistic in terms of trade and strategic relations. And in that sense, I think a lot can be done.
Are you surprised at the low profile that Indonesia still has, despite its size, despite its successes?
Indonesia is just a low-profile place, right? I mean, as you live here for a while, you realize that by and large, Indonesians really like Indonesia.
They love being home.
And if you don't, as a foreigner, if you don't get how much people love this country, then you've missed out. You haven't figured it out. But because they love the country so much, in some ways, they're not very good at selling it. You don't get the big flashy ad campaigns, Malaysia, truly Asia. Malaysia's not truly Asia. Indonesia is truly Asia. Come on. Let's be honest. Beautiful Thailand or whatever it is. It's more fun in the Philippines. all of those tourism campaigns are very effective, have been when there was tourism. Hopefully there'll be again. Indonesia's never had an effective tourism campaign. They don't go out and sell themselves. Indonesians go to international conferences and sort of say, okay, this is what we're doing. Fine. Okay, next. They're not aggressive marketers of a country that they understand is the greatest place on earth in many ways, and that they really like it the way it is. But they're not good at marketing it. And it's frustrating sometimes because we frequently will say, well, tell your story better, go out and sell it, et cetera. And it's just not in the DNA of the country to go out and market the hell out of Indonesia. If you don't understand how great Indonesia is, then that's your problem.
People do not like leaving home. People,
No.
Pulang Kampung is a mystical thing. You go to Bali and you ask people if they've ever been to Jakarta, and they no, I've never left.
Yeah,
why would you?
A lot of people are like that. And also it means that foreigners are treated with suspicion sometimes at an official level. Are you coming here to do us harm, to do us wrong, to somehow, what are you doing here? Why are you're only here to make money? We hear these things over and over again. It hurts Indonesia on the investment side, without a doubt. It pains me that so much of the new investment in Southeast Asia is going to Vietnam or Thailand instead of coming to Indonesia, because I think, properly managed, they should be able to grow. They should be able to grow have much more robust growth and much more investment. It'll come with time, I guess, but you can't really push it. That's why Americans standing up and pounding on a lectern someplace and saying, by golly, you Indonesians need to do this and this and this. That doesn't work. You can't lecture Indonesia into doing what you think it should be doing.
As an American watching the election from afar, how did you feel? How did it make you feel? And how do you feel now?
Well, in my position in AmCham, I am nonpartisan. So I don't engage much publicly on politics, but it would be, it's inescapable to say that I was concerned about many of the things that were going on in the Trump administration. And I welcome, as I think many expats do, welcome a return to kind of normalcy and stability. There's an impact on longtime expats like myself when the American government or the American president is unpopular abroad. And it's easier for us when the American president is somebody that people feel a certain respect and kindness towards. So when we went from George W. Bush to Obama, it was night and day in terms of how people reacted to you as an American, because, of course, especially in the Islamic countries, George W. Bush was not very popular. Turns out he probably wasn't such a bad president after all. He's not that bad a guy. He was okay. But the change was palpably different when you had Obama there. Obama was kind of like I think people kind of saw him as their president globally in a lot of countries. Certainly Indonesians did, given his childhood experience in Indonesia. So, I'm hopeful that the United States figures out how to manage its own transition and that we get on with the business of a new government. And if that new government is successful, of course, I'll be proud of it. As the business community, we're anxious to work with any administration. But let's see where this goes and hope that the United States credibility and friendship is enhanced in a new administration.
On that hopeful note, we'll leave it there. Lin Neumann, thank you so much for joining me.
All right. Well, my pleasure. Thanks, Jeff.
And that's the pod. Thank you to Lin Neumann and the American Chamber of Commerce. Our producer is Stephen Handoko. Reporting by Imam Shofwan. Music by Soundstripe. As always, you can contact us on Instagram at @onthelevel_podcast. And if you like us, please rate us. I'm Jeff Hutton. We'll be back next week with more interviews that are on the level.